So parking. It's a good with an elusive quality. It's ubiquitous, yet simultaneously it's always difficult to find. This image, for example, is a typical scene that we have in mind when we're considering a successful implementation of what our ideas look like. We have bicyclists, pedestrians, active retail fronts, and mixed-use buildings. But most importantly, we have people. There's lots of people in this space. But spaces like these are literally illegal in pretty much every city in Canada. But why? If this is what we want, then why do we make rules in spaces that result in spaces that look like this? Wide open spaces that are underutilized. There's no pedestrian infrastructure here, and the nearest building would require you to get into your car and drive. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about why minimum parking requirements are the single most important regulations that we have that shape the physical design of cities and the people's choices of where to live, work, shop, and socialize. But first, let's briefly go over some context to the status quo by exploring the history of minimum parking requirements. At the end of World War II and through the 1950s, a rapid change in North American culture took hold, alongside a rapid rise in home and vehicle ownership. The problems facing planners were much different then compared to now. Suburban flight was just taking hold, fueled by a growing middle class and severe housing shortage within the cities. The suburbs offered new opportunities after decades of disinvestment and neglect due to the Great Depression and World War II rationing. Zoning was new. It was only about 30 years old, which is about as old as new urbanism is today. Growing automobile dependence alongside a growing population meant that the streets built for pedestrians, trams, and trolleys and cyclists could not accommodate all the demand for parking. Motorists, unable to find a place to park at their desired destination, began parking in front of someone else's home or business. And those other residents and businesses complained. City councils, as they often do, looked at zoning to solve the problem. Seeking to manage the supply of parking, cities started adopting minimum parking requirements that forced landowners to provide off-street parking for all of the potential parking demand for each of the individual uses. Parking was viewed as an externality to a business, based on the perspective that it was logical to require business to develop parking spaces to make sure that there was no spillover parking onto the street or onto neighbors' properties. And so minimum parking requirements made sense. But I'm not sure if they realized how this rule would impact the culture and investment within cities. But the impact was big. It was really big. Part of what made this new rule have such a large impact was how the number of required spaces was determined. The first parking regulations were determined by observation. The engineers and planners collected data from automobile-dependent locations to establish the maximum observed rates of parking demand, and then they turned those maximum observed rates into the minimum parking requirement. Parking studies are expensive and time-consuming. Effectively, this meant that the highest demand time of day, the business would be able to accommodate all of its parking on demand on-site for free. Parking studies are expensive and time-consuming, so in the interest of not reinventing the wheel, cities looked to what other cities were doing and borrowed some of these ratios. Eventually, this more or less arbitrary number was prevalent across much of the country and then found its way into influential publications such as the Institute for Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Manual. But what if this number is not right for you or your community or Edmonton? What if the assumptions used to collect this data are simply not valid or no longer applicable, such as, is there really such thing as too much parking? Is spillover always a bad thing? Should all of the parking be provided for free? And is it necessary to provide enough parking to accommodate all the business's own parking requirement on the busiest day of the year? These are questions that this city and everybody's city needs to answer, since each will have a different need, value, and vision for how they want their city to develop in the future. Edmonton describes its vision within the Ways documents. The plans are filled with optimistic, inclusive language such as provide a variety of housing types, foster a vibrant, sustainable community, create a walkable, mixed-use main streets. You know, stuff that we can all get behind, like warm apple pie. Yet, we approve developments that bear no meaningful resemblance to these policies. We as planners need to overcome this cognitive dissonance. If we really want to encourage people to be active, then we need to support them in their choice. After all, every motorist becomes a pedestrian at the destination. So where would you rather walk? Here or here? Minimum parking requirements are neither good or bad. It really depends on what the city's vision for the future is and how the city intends to influence the lives of its residents. In this example from Strong Towns blog, you can see two examples of the kind of bill form that results from alternate public policy choices. The left images on top and bottom show a Strode, where the level of service is the first priority, and the minimum parking regulations space apart the buildings and block faces. The right images show build two lines, value-creating public space with far higher proportion of the space dedicated to humans rather than vehicles. These kind of policy decisions affect the economic strength of the region, the affordability of residential housing, the viability of redevelopment, and the attractiveness of commercial space to leaseholders. Your city can have all the great policy and plans and incentives to achieve the built form objectives of walkability, transportation mode shift, and vibrant commercial areas. But if we prioritize parking, as we have been, then we won't get a district shown as we have on this slide, but rather we will and have end up with a space devoid of life. In the past 70 years or so, our shared urban spaces have been designed exclusively around the automobile transportation with traffic throughput as a primary objective. And as a result, we get parking craters like the Dodger Stadium shown here, which is inhospitable to all life, except perhaps some brave weeds growing up through the cracks in the asphalt. Decades have passed since the first minimum parking requirements became law. And in that time, cumulative policy decisions and trillions of dollars of investment have given us the legacy we have inherited today. It will take decades to shift the inertia of these institutions and interests that have built up around the status quo. But if we are serious about our vision for creating a healthier, more active, and sustainable communities, then we have to start somewhere. And I think that the low-hanging fruit is the minimum parking spaces that we require for all new or changing developments. If our municipal official plans are a true reflection of our shared values and shared vision, then I think that we are headed in the right direction. But to get there, we need to change the way we think about parking and the way that we prioritize it in our development decision making. The status quo will prevent these types of streetscapes from being developed because according to the rules, they don't have enough parking. The status quo marginalizes bicycles, pedestrians, and especially landscaping amenity to the leftover space after accommodating parking in buildings. Our shared urban spaces need to be redesigned to accommodate automobiles in an environment dominated by people instead of the other way around. It is the people who create value. It is the people who create wealth. And in prioritizing the needs of people, we will begin to change the health, financially and physically, of our cities. Because after all, just because you call something a walkable mixed-use community where you can live, work, and worship, doesn't mean that it's actually a walkable mixed-use community. This is a standard suburban office park development whose marketing team is trying to convince me that it's a walkable, sustainable utopia, but you can see from all the white space indicated here that it's just a really big parking lot. So what we need to do is decide whether we're going to set the rules to look backwards to accommodate the existing legacy, or to set the rules to look forward to the city that we want to build. One of the ways that we can do this is reprioritizing parking during the permitting process so that building design takes precedence, followed by the amenity space, and then followed by parking. The rules of the bylaw should consider the lot coverage of the required parking in the context of the typical site size and other competing uses for the space. But to start first, let's just talk about the different ways that people think about parking so that we're all talking about the same thing. So there's three ways that I can think about parking. So the first one is it's an ancillary service like a bathroom. Every site should have its own. The second one is like infrastructure, pipes, sewers. It's a public service and it's a tool of wider policy implementation. And the third is that it's like a commodity, like real estate or coffee, and allows private decisions to shape supply. So let's talk about each one of these individually here for a second. So parking is like a bathroom. Every site should have its own parking. Minimum parking requirements are a key tool to quell fears over spillover parking or chaos in the streets. There's expectation of zero direct cost to the driver. And the policy goals are that even on the busiest day of the year, the site will be able to accommodate all of its own parking for free. There's little direct return on the investment, so the thinking is that the private sector would underprovide these spaces unless they were forced to by regulations. And to the rescue come regulations in the form of parking or toilet requirements in planning and building codes. One rationale for requiring them with buildings is so that people won't have to use the street, or not too much anyway. There's no demand management in this way of thinking about it. The second way is thinking about it like infrastructure. So it requires active management, especially of the on-street parking supply through ticketing, enforcement, pricing, and mobile phone applications. It's used as district-based revitalization, so a park once district, or you front-load all of the parking into a development at the first phase, and then none of the subsequent phases would require parking. It manages conflicts through time limits, restricted eligibility, or supply adjustments. And this requires or encourages private parking lots to be open to the public. And the third way is fairly straightforward, and it's that it's a commodity that can be traded like any other. It's a form of real estate that can be bought, leased long-term, or rented for the short term. The parking policy and regulations need to consider both sides of supply and demand. And with the current zoning, it's the first one. It views it as a ancillary service, but sometimes it's blended model into the infrastructure model to manage parking in busy areas like the downtown. My personal view is that parking is a scarce resource in the economic sense. So I view the problem through the lens as parking as a commodity. As we do with minerals, metals, corn, grain, coffee, and other stuff, when a commodity is scarce, the demand for it is regulated by the price. And treating parking like a commodity happens in some places, usually downtowns of large cities, where demand constantly exceeds supply and the land values cannot justify creating additional parking spaces. But in all other areas, minimum parking requirements flood the market with supply, making it very difficult to directly charge motorists for supplying land to store their vehicle. So I encourage you to adopt a community-based or a commodity-based viewpoint, at least for this presentation, because it would manage supply and demand in an efficient way. But pay for parking. James, what are you thinking? This is crazy talk. So some of you guys might know these guys. Why pay for it when you can apply for it, when you can apply yourself and then maybe get it for free? That was said by George Costanza on Seinfeld. So the cultural expectation is that you're unlucky or unwise to pay for parking. So how does free destination parking affect how people decide to travel? In this example, I pulled biking and walking in automobile times from Google Maps. In Edmonton, 8-kilometer trip from my house across the river to White Avenue. And so you can see that biking, walking, and driving are free because when people decide how they're going to travel, the direct cost is usually not a deciding factor. Car payment, insurance are considered sunk costs. Gas is usually not considered. The cost of a new bicycle or a new pair of shoes isn't considered. But what is considered is the availability of parking at a destination, how much it costs in the case of driving, or how secure it is in the case of biking, or how long it's going to take in the case of walking or transit. Biking is free, but the roadways might not be suitable or safe for bicycling, or the bike might not be outfitted for the ease in transporting goods, or there may not be a secure place to park your bike. Transit has a direct trip cost. It takes almost as long as walking, and the schedule may not be convenient or available when you want to travel. And walking is free, but it may be inconvenient in bad weather or take too long to complete the trip. So if driving is faster and parking is provided in abundance for free, then why not drive for all of our trips? And indeed, 65% of all trips are made in the private vehicle. When parking is underpriced, it will always be in high demand. Take a nice steak, for example. This is a type of good that is subject to what economists call consumption rivalry. If I eat this steak, it's not available to any of you guys. Sorry, I like steak. The other aspect of the good is whether I can exclude you from it. In the case of a steak, it's easy to exclude you. You just can't have any. There's no way for you to enjoy the steak without paying for one of your own. This is in contrast to something that is non-excludable, like the law, where you guys can have law and I can have law, and it doesn't affect anybody else's law. An example of a non-rival good would be radio waves, because anyone can tune into them without degrading the signal for others. And much like a steak, parking is both rivalrous and excludable, meaning parking is not a public good, it is a private good which can have a market price. And I mean public good in the sense of economics, not in the sense of being owned by the public like a city. Now imagine if we tried to pretend that a steak was a public good by refusing to ration it, and that we didn't exclude anyone. Let's say that the mayor of Edmonton decided that the people are hungry and that they needed to eat. And he wanted to provide steak for everyone, but being a good steward of the tax dollars that he is, he went for hamburgers instead. So he orders hamburgers to fill all of Churchill Square. And he tells his constituents that they can have as much as they want for free starting at 7 a.m. People show up and they begin to take all that they can eat and more. By 11 a.m., the pile of hamburgers is gone. The people who showed up late bemoan the fact that there was a shortage of hamburgers. When the mayor heard this, he was surprised. "My people are still hungry," he declared. He ordered his staff to provide even more hamburgers the next day, and he decided to change the venue to West Edmonton Mall because there's much larger space and it can hold more hamburgers. The next day, the mall opens at 7 a.m. and there's already a lineup. Channel 9 News is on site to record the event, and soon after the mall opens, people are fighting over hamburgers. Kids are crying. There's a guy crowd surfing at the front of the line. By 9 a.m., all of the hamburgers were gone. Yet, people were still complaining that they were hungry. They couldn't find any hamburgers, or that all the hamburgers were gone. The mayor realized that this is a much, much more serious problem than he imagined. And he ordered all of the businesses in Edmonton to provide 2 hamburgers to every customer who came into their store, even if they didn't buy anything. It was a great day for solving hunger. But it took some time for the effects to be felt, and the people of Edmonton became fat. The doorways needed to be widened. New seats needed to be installed in the theater. Grocery stores were left abandoned, and some buildings needed to be torn down to make way for more piles of hamburgers. People knew that hamburgers were causing all these problems, and even the mayor reluctantly agreed. But people had become accustomed to the hamburgers, and they felt entitled to the hamburgers, and changing this would be unpopular, and so nothing changed. When things are given away for free, people will overconsume them, and it is possible to realize that provided that parking is given away for free, parking demand will always be high. Economists call this induced demand. When users pay the actual cost of providing parking, many people will choose to walk or bike or take transit instead. So I propose that we don't force more parking to be provided than people are willing to pay for, and that we build our infrastructure to support active modes, and ideally transportation funding would be distributed in line with the mode share. So if bicycle trips account for 1% of all trips, bicycle infrastructure should get 1% of all funding. Or preferably, if we want to see bicycle trips accounting for 5% of all trips, then maybe 5% of all transportation funding should go towards the bicycles. So cities are, by definition, places where people and activities locate close together. This co-location reduces the cost to people and businesses of reaching goods, services, and activities. And this facilitates trade. Space is always constrained in cities, and as a result, cities benefit economically and become more livable, favoring space-efficient modes, walking, cycling, ride-sharing, public transit, over space-intensive modes like low-occupant vehicle travel. In simple terms, this means that parking cannot grow at the same rate that the city grows. This is because while offices, people, retail, and other productive uses can be stacked economically, streets and parking structures cannot. An automobile-dependent city will always be constrained by the amount of parking it can have. The move away from policies like minimum parking requirements is framed as an ideological shift. Josh Switzky of the San Francisco Planning Department says it's even simpler than that. He said that there are physical limits to cramming cars into the city. It's about geometry. We have to figure out how to accommodate people more efficiently. How parking is built and how much is built has a huge effect on what our municipalities look like. If we want healthier, more beautiful cities, then we need to stop planning for cars. But how do we get there? I think we start with the cultural attitudes and expectations. I think we can all agree that each of us needs healthy food and comfortable shelter and warm clothing. So why doesn't the government force developers to provide these things as a condition of being given permission to build too? This hierarchy of human needs describes human motivation. The needs at the bottom of the pyramid need to be met before the needs at the top. Notice how food, water, shelter, and comfortable temperature are all at the bottom, indicating their fundamental importance. And we use the market to balance the supply and demand of these basic goods. But there's something missing. In our society, we assume that parking is a human need, so fundamental that it should be provided free for all trips. I find it strange that we're willing to accept a market economy for basic human needs, yet we're willing to accept administrative command economy for parking. When I see minimum parking requirements so prevalent across all municipalities, I wonder what dire event occurred that required us to retool our economy to provide this fundamental human need. We need to remember that parking demand, like any other good in our society, is a factor of not just supply, but also of demand. And the intersection of these two sets the price for a good. Is providing housing for cars really more important than providing housing for people? Well, if you read Sun News, you probably think so. Take, for example, this recent article about Edmonton's decision to freeze the construction of new bicycle infrastructure. The article prominently features a car advertisements on the side. You don't need to bike, it says. You just need to buy a car. We have lots of cars for every budget. No credit check required. Everyone's approved. And this isn't an isolated incident. Consider the broad cultural attitudes towards non-motorists. Building forward means addressing these deeply ingrained cultural expectations head on. If someone is seen walking down the street, the immediate reaction is to see if they're okay. Or when a child is interested in choosing an active mode and gaining a little bit of freedom, his mother is concerned that all the traffic around his school at the time. Or this municipality thinks that removing a crosswalk will improve safety. Or the fact that the road crossing is illegal in most jurisdictions. Or we build roads to prioritize automobile travel over all other modes. But what if it wasn't this way? I think changing people's perceptions can be challenging. And things that are new and different are scary. People need to be assured that things will be okay and show examples of how removing parking can improve their business or their livelihood. Start incrementally by removing parking minimums, but not instituting a maximum. Develop community-based social marketing programs to start a dialogue in the community. Set common expectations, such as the right-of-way belongs to all users, and it isn't an extension of your own personal land. Which brings me into my next part. So this is the porch that I like to sit on. It's my house. I've not owned a car in 14 years, but I do own 3 parking spaces. I'm legally required to own these 3 off-street parking spaces, and they take up about 1/3 of the lot. Because my house was built in 1913, shortly after Edmonton became a city, and long before it imposed a parking minimum, I would be grandfathered out of the requirement entirely. But because my house does have parking spaces, I'm not allowed to remove them. I would rather use that space for other things, like a larger amenity space. You're allowed to fill your garage with stuff while you store your car in the city right-of-way. But you're not allowed to fill your garage with stuff with your car and store your stuff in the right-of-way. Undeveloped lots in my neighborhood sell for about $180,000, which works out to about $490 per square meter of land. The land use for parking is about 60 square meters on my property, or about $29,400. The land in the right-of-way used for parking in front of my house is about 25 square meters, and that works out to about $12,250 worth of land. Yet, the City of Edmonton gives away the use of this public asset for free. And the city, like all cities, gives it away for only one purpose, and that's storing private motor vehicles. I'm not even allowed to rent out my unused parking spaces because that would be considered non-accessory parking, and I need to get a business license. So I'm literally forced to keep this land fallow with no productive use. So in total, $41,650 approximately is tied up to create about 4.5 parking spaces, none of which are used. I can keep cars, trucks, motorcycles there, free storage of personal private property, but no other storage would be permitted. I can't keep sea cans or construction waste bins. It would be illegal for me to put a bike rack on the public street to store my Opus or Rocky Mountain bicycles. I couldn't even put a shoe rack out there. But I could store my vehicle there year-round without any problem. But consider this. Despite my property being legally required to contain these 3 parking spaces, there's no requirement for me to keep my garage free of stuff. And since the city lets everyone park in the street for free, many people do. And the required off-street parking space with stuff that I'm sure that they'll use one day. So, Instead of giving away this for free, on-street parking needs demand-responsive pricing. In some cases, it would still be free because not a lot of people are using it. But residential permits should be able to be bought and sold and not tied to a particular address or vehicle. And I should be able to rent out my parking spaces without planning approvals or convert them into a more productive use.